My parents wanted to access my account to steal $32,000 to buy an expensive apartment for my golden sister and then I. I'm a 20-year-old guy in college, and the relationship I have with my family has always been rocky. Mostly, it's because I'm nothing like the rest of them. Over the years, I've worked hard to achieve what I have today, maintaining top grades and even securing a scholarship for college. I thought this would finally earn me some respect, but that hasn't happened. My parents have always had a clear favorite, and it's not me. My sister Ashley, who's now 25, has always been spoiled and entitled. It's been obvious to me for years that they see her as the golden child, while I'm expected to be the one who handles everything on my own. Whenever she makes a mess, I'm the one who has to clean it up, or worse, sacrifice something for her. Over the years, I managed to save up $32,000 for college. It took a lot of effort, and most of it came from part-time jobs and scholarships. This money means everything to me. It's my ticket to independence, my chance to break free from depending on anyone else. But for my parents, it was just another pool of money they could dip into whenever Ashley ran into trouble. At 25, Ashley is still unemployed. She likes to claim she's figuring things out, but mostly, she just lounges around, doing nothing. Lately, she's decided that she needs to move into a new, high-end apartment in one of the nicer parts of town. Of course, she has no money, no job, and no savings to afford it. So, one evening, my parents sat me down to inform me that Ashley had found the perfect place. The problem? She didn't have enough for the deposit. Then they demanded, that I hand over my entire college savings, all $32,000 of it. I was in complete shock. They didn't even bother asking. They just demanded it, like they had the right to take what I had worked so hard for. And if that wasn't bad enough, they told me that if I refused, I could pack my things and leave their house. That's when I realized that my future, everything I'd been working toward, meant nothing to them if it came down to Ashley's comfort. My mom even tried to play the family comes first card, while my dad said something ridiculous about how Ashley had always been there for me, which is just flat out untrue. Then they pulled out the emotional manipulation, claiming that if I were a good brother, I'd give her the money without hesitation. I was too shocked to even respond at first. How could they possibly believe it was fair to take away everything I'd saved for and hand it over to someone who's never taken responsibility for herself? My dad just shrugged and said it was about keeping the family together. My mom, on the other hand, insisted that Ashley needed the apartment more than I needed my savings. It became painfully clear that, no matter what I said, they wouldn't listen. They didn't care about fairness. They only cared about Ashley. The next few days were a mental tug-of-war. I kept thinking about my options, weighing whether or not I should just give in. The thought of being kicked out was terrifying, but the more I thought about it, the angrier I became. Why should I have to sacrifice everything I've worked for just because Ashley refuses to take care of herself? But standing my ground meant risking everything, especially because I didn't have a backup plan. I didn't have anywhere to go if they kicked me out. I even considered reaching out to some extended family members, but I knew they'd be no help. Most of them had already bought into Ashley's act, just like my parents had. Eventually, I made up my mind. I wasn't going to let them bully me into giving up my savings. I started researching my legal rights, and I knew that, as an adult, they couldn't take my money without my consent. I also made sure to secure all of my important documents, birth certificate, passport, banking information, just in case things took a turn for the worse. I began quietly packing my belongings and moved some of my valuables to a friend's place, so that I'd be ready to leave in a hurry if it came to that. I also reached out to my college's housing office to see if they had any emergency accommodations. While they didn't, they pointed me toward local resources that might be able to help. When I finally confronted my parents, I stood my ground. I told them I wasn't going to hand over my savings, and if they really wanted to kick me out over this, I was ready to go. My dad flew into a rage, accusing me of being selfish and ungrateful. My mom cried, saying she couldn't believe I was willing to tear the family apart over what she called just a little money. If it was such a small amount, why didn't they cover it themselves? Ashley, of course, threw a tantrum. She screamed about how I was ruining her life and how I didn't care about her happiness. My parents stood there, glaring at me, waiting for me to cave. But I didn't. I told them that if they wanted me gone, I'd be out by the end of the week. The days that followed were pure hell. My parents barely spoke to me, and when they did, it was only to throw more guilt my way. My mom gave me the silent treatment, while my dad resorted to making snide remarks whenever I was around. Ashley refused to even look at me, acting as though I'd personally betrayed her. Despite the unbearable atmosphere, I continued preparing to leave. I moved the rest of my belongings to my friend's house and made sure I had a place to stay temporarily. I also confided in more friends, letting them know what was going on. They were incredibly supportive and even suggested I look into legal action if things got worse. Things hit a breaking point one morning when I found out that my parents had tried to access my bank account without my permission. They must have thought they could just take the money and deal with the fallout later, but I had anticipated this and moved all the money out of that account and closed it. When they discovered what I'd done, they were livid. My dad screamed at me, calling me ungrateful and accusing me of destroying the family. My mom sobbed, asking how I could do this to them, but I held my ground. I told them they had crossed the line, and if they wanted me out, I'd go. But they weren't getting a penny of my savings. I wasn't about to let them twist the narrative either. I decided to take matters into my own hands by going public with what had happened. I posted a detailed account of the whole situation on social media, including how they had tried to force me to give up my savings, the threats they made, and all the emotional blackmail they used. I even attached screenshots of their texts and the alerts I'd received when they tried to access my bank account. To make sure the truth spread, I tagged my parents, Ashley, and several of their friends and extended family members. The reaction was swift and overwhelming. Almost everyone sided with me, offering their support and calling out my parents and Ashley for their behavior. Some distant relatives even reached out, shocked by what they'd learned. A few people, mostly close friends of my parents, tried to defend them, but they were quickly drowned out by the outpouring of support for me. My parents' image of being a perfect family was completely shattered. My dad's work relationships became strained, as colleagues started distancing themselves from him. My mom, who had always been obsessed with her social standing, found herself being quietly excluded from her usual circles. And Ashley? Her plans for a fancy new apartment fell apart when the landlord got wind of the drama and backed out of the deal. After the confrontation, I moved in with a supportive friend. It wasn't an ideal situation, but it was a far better environment than the one I'd left behind. Adjusting to independence was difficult, but also liberating. I was finally able to focus on my studies and my future without constantly worrying about what my family would try to take from me next. My parents, of course, didn't take the fallout well. They flooded my phone with calls and messages, alternating between threats and desperate pleas for me to take down the social media post. They even tried to spin the story, claiming they were just trying to help Ashley during a tough time. But by then, it was too late. Everyone already knew the truth. I blocked them on every platform and started looking into getting a restraining order if they didn't back off. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was necessary to protect myself from their toxic influence. A few estranged relatives reached out afterward, expressing their support and regret for not stepping in sooner. My college even offered me additional financial aid after hearing about my situation, which was a huge relief. Over the course of all this, I've grown stronger, more confident, and more self-reliant than I ever thought possible. My academic performance has improved now that I'm not constantly stressed about my family. I've also built a new support system of friends who genuinely care about me. Looking ahead, I'm seriously considering cutting ties with my family for good. The cycle of toxicity has gone on for too long, and I'm committed to breaking free from it. It won't be easy, but I'm determined to build a better future for myself. One where I'm no longer looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next betrayal. So Reddit, am I wrong for refusing to give up my college savings for my sister and for going public about what my family tried to do to me? Update 1. It's been about 4 months since I posted my original story, and a lot has changed. First, I want to thank everyone for the support and advice. I couldn't have made it through without that encouragement. After I moved out and made my story public, things got pretty intense with my family. My parents and Ashley didn't take it well, to say the least. They kept trying to contact me, switching between angry threats and guilt-tripping, but I held firm with my decision to cut off contact. About a week after I moved out, My mom showed up unannounced at my friend's place. I have no idea how she found out where I was staying. She was crying and begging me to come home, saying they had made a mistake and wanted to make things right. For a moment, I almost felt bad for her. But then she switched gears and started telling me how I was tearing the family apart and how much Ashley was suffering because of me. That's when I knew nothing had really changed. I told her to leave or I'd call the police. She left, but not before telling me I was breaking her heart. The next day, my dad called my college, trying to get information about my class schedule. Luckily, I'd already talked to the administration about my situation, so they didn't give him any information. But it freaked me out that they were trying to track me down like that. Things escalated when Ashley started showing up at places she knew I frequented, like the library, the coffee shop near campus, and even outside some of my classes. She tried to corner me, alternating between screaming at me for ruining her life and begging me to give her the money. It got so bad that I had to change my routines and start having friends walk with me between classes. About 2 months after I left, I got a surprising email from Jason, Ashley's ex-boyfriend. They had broken up a few months before all of this happened, and I'd always thought he was a decent guy who just got caught up in our family's drama. He apologized for not reaching out sooner and said he wanted to show his support. Jason also shared some things about Ashley that completely shocked me. Apparently, she'd been cheating on him for most of their relationship, often with guys who could afford to buy her expensive gifts or take her on trips. He said she constantly talked about how she deserved a more luxurious lifestyle and how unfair it was that she had to work for anything. That really changed the way I saw her behavior. Jason also told me that Ashley had been fired from her last job for stealing, and my parents had covered it up by paying back what she had taken. They did this while expecting me to give up everything I'd worked for. I was furious. About 3 months after I left, I got a call from an unknown number. It turned out to be my grandfather on my dad's side. We had never been close, as he lived in another state, and I hadn't seen him much over the years. He told me he'd heard what happened through the family and wanted to hear my side of the story. I was hesitant at first, given what had happened with my aunt, but as we talked, I realized he was genuinely concerned. My grandfather told me that he had his own issues with my dad over the years and wasn't surprised by what had happened. He apologized for not being more present in my life and even offered to help me out financially if I needed it. While I was touched by his offer, I told him I wanted to make it on my own, and he respected that. It meant a lot to know that someone in my family was on my side. The conversation with my grandfather made me curious about other relatives, so I reached out to a couple of cousins on my mom's side. One of them, Emily, shared her own experiences with my parents and Ashley. Emily had gone through a tough divorce a few years ago and needed a place to stay for a couple of weeks. My parents had initially offered her a room, but after Ashley complained about having her space invaded, they kicked Emily out after only 2 days. She ended up having to stay on friends' couches until she found an apartment. I couldn't believe they had done that to family while demanding I give up everything for Ashley. With all of this going on, I was still trying to figure out my living situation. My friends' parents were kind enough to let me stay with them, but I knew it couldn't be a permanent solution. I started looking for a cheap apartment near campus, but everything was way out of my budget. Then, a few days later, I ran into one of Ashley's friends at the grocery store. She tried to guilt-trip me, saying Ashley was depressed and that it was all my fault. I asked her if Ashley had told her the full story. She admitted she only knew Ashley's version. I gave her my side, and I could see doubt creeping into her expression. She walked away, looking confused, and I felt a small sense of victory. The next day, I got a call from my bank. Someone had tried to access my new account using my social security number. The bank flagged it as suspicious activity and blocked it. I knew immediately it was my parents. I filed a police report and started the process of putting a freeze on my credit. I was shaken by how far they were willing to go. At that point, I realized I had to take more serious action. I went back to the lawyer I'd consulted earlier and started the process of getting a restraining order against my parents and Ashley. It felt like a drastic step, but I had no other choice. The day before the hearing, my mom called me in a panic, begging me not to go through with it. She cried, saying the restraining order would destroy the family and that they needed me to come home. I told her they should have thought about that before trying to steal from me and hung up. The hearing was intense. My parents and Ashley showed up with a lawyer of their own and tried to make me look like an ungrateful, troubled kid who was lashing out at his loving family. But I had all the evidence: the texts, the emails, the social media posts, and the bank records. The judge saw right through their act and granted the restraining order. As I was leaving the courthouse, Ashley tried to approach me one last time. She looked terrible, like she hadn't been sleeping. She started to say she was sorry, but her face twisted with anger, and she spat out, "I hope you're happy now that you've ruined all our lives," before storming off. I moved into a new apartment with some help from friends, and I've managed to save up enough to cover my living expenses for a while. I also found a part-time job to help with my bills. Balancing work and school is tough, but it feels good to be completely independent. Update 2. It's been a year since my last update, and things have changed so much. First, I want to thank everyone again for your continued support. I couldn't have gotten through all this without you. After the restraining order was granted, things were quiet for a while. I thought my family had finally gotten the message. But 3 months ago, I got a call from my uncle, my dad's brother. We've never been close, but he sounded concerned. He told me that things had spiraled out of control with my parents and Ashley. According to him, Ashley had gotten involved with some shady people and racked up a massive amount of debt. My parents, in their infinite wisdom, decided to take out a second mortgage on the house to try to pay off her debts. But it wasn't enough. One night, the people Ashley owed money to showed up at my parents' house. Things got ugly. My uncle didn't know all the details, but he said the police were involved, and my dad ended up in the hospital with a broken arm. Here's the part that blows my mind. Despite everything, my parents are still trying to protect Ashley. They told the police it was just a random break-in, even though the truth has gotten out within the family. My uncle said they're drowning in debt, but they're still standing by her. A few days after my uncle's call, I started getting messages from my parents again. I had unblocked them because I thought maybe they had changed. Big mistake. They were begging me to come home, saying they needed my help. They even tried to guilt me by saying that if I had given them the money when they first asked, none of this would have happened. Can you believe that? They're still trying to make this my fault. I ignored their messages and blocked them again. Since then, I've moved into a better apartment in a safer neighborhood. It's a little farther from campus, but it's worth the peace of mind. Unfortunately, Ashley showed up at my place recently, violating the restraining order. I have no idea how she found out where I lived, as I had just moved. She was a complete mess, crying, begging for money, and saying she was in danger. I told her to leave or I'd call the cops. She screamed at me, saying that if anything happened to her, it would be all my fault. I immediately called my lawyer, and we're in the process of extending the restraining order to cover my new address. I also had to inform my landlord and neighbors about the situation, just in case my parents or Ashley tried anything again. On top of all that, I found out through some family members that my parents have been telling everyone I'm the one who got Ashley into trouble. They're claiming I introduced her to these shady people and that I owe money too. It's absolute nonsense, but some relatives actually believe it. I've had to block several family members on social media because of the hateful messages they've been sending me. Despite all this, things have been looking up for me. I've made new friends who feel more like family than my actual relatives ever did. We're even planning to spend the holidays together, which I'm really looking forward to. As for my parents and Ashley, I've heard through the grapevine that they're facing foreclosure on the house. Part of me feels bad for them, but I also know they brought this on themselves by enabling Ashley for so long. I can't help but think how different things could have been if they had just respected my boundaries and treated me fairly. Final update. It's been a year since I last updated, and I can hardly believe how much has happened. What started as me fighting for control over my future has spiraled into a series of events that I never could have imagined. I thought cutting ties with my family would bring some peace. A few months after I moved into my new apartment and got the restraining order extended, things seemed to calm down. I was settling into my new life, balancing school, work, and my growing independence. I was still in contact with some supportive relatives, but overall, I was focused on moving forward. It seemed like my parents and Ashley had finally accepted that I was out of their lives for good, and I hadn't heard from them since Ashley's desperate plea outside my apartment. At least, that's what I thought. But then, something unexpected happened. One evening, I received a phone call from an unknown number. Normally, I wouldn't answer, but for some reason, I picked up. It was the police. The officer on the other end of the line calmly explained that my parents had been involved in a severe accident. Apparently, while they were driving home one evening, their car veered off the road and crashed into a ditch. Both my mom and dad had been taken to the hospital in critical condition. The officer didn't have much more information at the time, but he said my presence might be needed. I was completely blindsided. I hadn't spoken to them in months, but hearing they were in such a dire state hit me hard. Despite everything, they were still my parents. After hanging up, I sat there, torn between rushing to the hospital or maintaining the distance I'd fought so hard for. Eventually, I decided to go. When I arrived at the hospital, the sight of them shocked me to my core. My dad was in a medically induced coma, his body connected to machines that kept him alive. My mom was in slightly better shape but had sustained multiple injuries, including a broken leg and internal bleeding. The doctors weren't sure if my dad was going to make it. As I stood there, staring at the frail figures of the people who had made my life so difficult, I couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. Guilt, anger, sadness, it all swirled together. Part of me wanted to turn around and walk out, but another part of me felt compelled to stay. I sat with my mom for a while, watching her unconscious form. That's when I noticed something strange. A nurse walked into the room and handed me a few of my mom's personal belongings, including her purse. She told me they had recovered it from the scene of the accident. As I absent-mindedly looked through it, my heart nearly stopped when I found something inside. A letter addressed to me, written in my mom's handwriting. The letter was brief, but its contents were chilling. In it, my mom confessed to something that turned my entire world upside down. She admitted that she and my dad had been involved in something much darker than I'd realized. They had been trying to cover up a massive financial scandal within my dad's company for the past few years, and the pressure had been mounting. But here's the worst part. They had been planning to fake their own deaths to escape the fallout. The car accident wasn't an accident at all. It had been a failed attempt at staging a fatal crash. As I stood there, trying to process what I just read, my mind raced. I couldn't believe it. My parents had been living a double life, hiding their involvement in illegal activities. But what truly broke me was the realization that they were willing to leave Ashley and me behind, completely erase themselves from our lives to avoid the consequences of their actions. It was clear that they had no intention of taking responsibility for the mess they'd created. I left the hospital that night, feeling more confused and betrayed than ever before. How could they? How could they have dragged me into their web of lies without me even knowing? I didn't know what to do next. Should I report what I'd found? Should I confront them when they woke up? If they woke up? A few days later, I received another call, this time from the hospital. My dad had regained consciousness. Despite everything, I couldn't resist going back to face him. When I walked into the room, I expected an apology, maybe some sign of regret. But what I got was far worse. My dad, weak and hooked up to machines, smirked when he saw me. "I didn't expect you to show up," he croaked, his voice strained. I stood there, speechless. I didn't know what to say. But before I could respond, he continued. "You don't know the half of it," he said, his smirk widening. "I was doing all of this for you and your sister." "For me?" I finally managed to say. "How the hell was faking your death for me?" His response shook me to my core. He explained that the financial scandal had escalated far beyond what I had imagined. He and my mom had gotten involved with dangerous people, people who were now threatening not just them, but Ashley and me as well. The only way out, according to him, was to disappear, to start fresh somewhere far away. But their plan had failed when the accident didn't go as planned. I left the hospital, sick to my stomach. I had always known my parents were manipulative, but I never imagined they'd drag me into something this sinister. And what about Ashley? Did she know? Was she part of this too? My gut told me to get as far away from them as possible, but the situation took another unexpected turn a few weeks later when I got a frantic call from Ashley herself. She sounded terrified, almost hysterical. She told me that she had been approached by two men who had come to her apartment, demanding money and threatening her life. According to Ashley, These were the same men my dad had gotten involved with. I didn't want to get involved, but something in her voice made me realize how serious the situation had become. These people were dangerous, and they were coming for Ashley, and possibly for me. I agreed to meet with her to figure out what was going on. When I arrived at the location we'd agreed upon, a small, run-down cafe on the edge of town, I barely recognized Ashley. She looked disheveled, pale, and genuinely scared for the first time in her life. As we sat down to talk, she revealed that she had known about our parents' financial crimes for a while, but hadn't told me out of fear. She had tried to distance herself from them, but now that they were in trouble, these men were holding her responsible too. For the first time in years, I saw a vulnerability in Ashley that I had never seen before. She wasn't the spoiled, entitled sister I had grown up with. She was terrified. But even then, I couldn't completely trust her. After all, she had lied to me before. In the weeks that followed, things continued to unravel. I began receiving strange phone calls and noticed unfamiliar cars parked outside my apartment. It became clear that these people knew where I lived and were keeping tabs on me. I filed a police report, but there wasn't much they could do without solid evidence. Then, one night, I came home to find my apartment ransacked. Drawers were pulled out, belongings were scattered across the floor, and my laptop was missing. Panic set in as I realized these people were getting closer. I packed a bag and left that night, going to stay with a friend in another town. The next day, I received an anonymous message on my phone. It was a video of Ashley, bound and gagged, her eyes wide with fear. The message was simple: pay up or she dies. I didn't know what to do. My first instinct was to call the police, but I knew how dangerous these men were. I couldn't risk Ashley's life, but I also didn't have the money they were asking for. It was an impossible situation. Desperate, I reached out to my grandfather, the one person I thought might be able to help. When I explained the situation, he didn't hesitate. He wired the money to the account they had provided, and within a few hours, Ashley was released. But the ordeal wasn't over. I knew that as long as these men were out there, we were both in danger. I spent the next few months laying low, avoiding contact with anyone from my past. My relationship with Ashley was strained, but we both knew we had to stay united to survive this. Eventually, the police caught wind of the criminal group my parents had been involved with, and after a lengthy investigation, arrests were made. My parents were implicated, along with several other individuals involved in the scandal. My dad was sentenced to prison, while my mom was put on probation due to her injuries. As for me, I'm still trying to pick up the pieces. The trauma of everything that's happened has left me shaken, but I'm determined to move forward. I've cut off all contact with my parents, and I'm slowly rebuilding my life. Ashley and I have a fragile truce, but we're both haunted by the events of the past year. Looking back, I never could have imagined how far my family's dysfunction would go. What started as a battle over my college savings turned into something far darker, and it's left scars that may never fully heal. But one thing's for sure, I won't let my family's mistakes define me. I'm carving out a new path for myself, one that's free from the toxicity and chaos that defined my past. It's not easy, and I still struggle with the trauma of everything that happened, but I'm committed to building a future where I can live on my own terms. I've also taken steps to protect myself. I've changed my name legally, moved to a new state, and started over completely. Only a handful of people from my old life know where I am now, and I intend to keep it that way. I've learned the hard way that trust is fragile, and not everyone deserves it. As for my parents, they've tried to reach out to me from time to time, letters from my dad's prison and messages through distant family members from my mom. But I've made it clear that I want nothing to do with them. The damage they caused is too deep to repair. They chose their path, and now they have to live with the consequences. I've blocked every attempt at contact and intend to keep it that way for the rest of my life. Ashley, too, has distanced herself. After everything that happened, we both realized we're better off apart. She's trying to rebuild her life, though I can't say I trust that she's truly changed. We've parted ways, each of us haunted by what our family became, but understanding that our futures don't have to be defined by the chaos we left behind. In the end, the most shocking part of all of this isn't the financial crimes, the threats, or even the kidnapping. It's the realization that I no longer have a family. not in the traditional sense. The people who raised me turned out to be strangers, capable of things I never thought possible. But in losing them, I've gained something far more valuable: freedom. Freedom from manipulation, control, and the constant fear of betrayal. It's a long road ahead, but for the first time, I feel like I'm in control of my own destiny. And no matter what happens next, I know one thing for certain: I'll never let anyone take that away from me again.